I'm here today with the illustrious Tom Newkirk to talk to him about one of his new books, one of many books that he's written that have helped myself and teachers think about literacy in ways that nobody else really does. He pushes your thinking and asks you to step outside of what you know to be true and consider options and different ways of seeing things. He's my dear friend, most of all, and my partner in all things funny. And yeah, we're here to talk to him about his new book that's coming out. When is it coming out, Tom?
I think February or March of next year.
Yep, and it's called Fiction Unbound, which
Writing Unbound.
Writing, you changed it.
Writing Unbound, how fiction transforms students.
Okay, maybe I had it wrong. Sorry.
Well, it's changed. It's been changing. So
kind of a step outside to talk about fiction. You talked about how you're not a fiction writer yourself, and to kind of step into this arena and talk to kids and adults, but mostly kids, right, about their own fiction writing. And I was lucky to be able to read that, one of those drafts early on, which I always love to do. So let's get to it. In one of the things that caught me right away was this idea that we're attracted to all of these horrible things, like, what do you say, deviance, danger, catastrophe, so long as we can experience them from a safe distance. You say it doesn't mean we or our students are warped or deviant. So I wonder if you could speak to that in terms of sort of the world we're living in right now and what that means to you today.
Well, it's almost like the world we're living in today. I mean, you imagine these kind of catastrophes, and we're kind of in the middle of a catastrophe. So it's almost, so I end the book saying, I'm really interested in what these fiction writers who I've spent so much time interviewing are going to make out of this pandemic, in terms of, the catastrophe that we're in. So that's an obvious connection. But, I'm always fascinated by our interest in darkness. And, like how many people, like if, I think the example I use in the book is if you're like, you see the traffic stop, and there's some accident and a slowdown and you're going slow and you're going by this car, and the humane side of your mind says, I just hope nobody's hurt. I hope it's just a minor thing. I hope, but there's a part of you that is kind of like, looking for a real big crash out. Maybe you're not wishing anybody dead, but the idea of something major happening, negative, there's something exciting about that, and there's something interesting about that. So I think we all have that in us, and sometimes you look at particularly like middle school kids liking these dark books, but there's a real fascination with deviance, with the extremes, and we allow that to happen in reading, and we kind of recognize the importance in reading, but not so much in writing. So if somebody writes about that, it's like, ooh, what's wrong with this kid? They're interested in this thing, but if they read it, we see, well, that's kind of natural, that's kind of normal. So one of the things in the book is, like, we have all these assumptions about reading that we don't transfer to writing.
Mm-hmm.
There's like a double standard, and so writing is far more bound than reading is, I think.
I love that term, bound. How did you come up with that?
Well, really, I stole it from Jeff Wilhelm and Michael Smith, because they had a book that I really loved called Reading Unbound.
Okay.
It was really about kids reading like vampire stories and dystopian stories and the stuff that's maybe outside the boundaries of what school reading is. Mm-hmm. And like I just love the kids talking about vampire stories, books that you might think could not elicit a really thoughtful, engaged response, and these kids were talking about them in the most detailed, thoughtful way. And so I thought, and then I talked to Jeff Wilhelm, and I said, I think there's got to be a sequel, and that's Writing Unbound, because writing is far more bound than reading, I think.
Agreed.
Partly it's bound because kids aren't allowed to write fiction or encouraged to write fiction in schools. So I kind of stole the idea from their book, and their book was like interview. It's almost like they had these readers that they interviewed being the tour guides. And that's what I says. I said, you using these people as tour guides, like they're showing you the way that this kind of reading is powerful for them. And so I said, I want to do the same thing. I want to have these writers who write fiction be the tour guides. So I'm not the expert. I can't be. I'm not a fiction writer, but they're the experts. And so I found these kids, and then they became my guides, my teachers.
I can't help but bring up Ernest, one of your major guides, right?
Oh, he's like the guide of the guides. Yeah, he's. I think I started. I don't know if he was in 9th grade or 10th grade when I first interviewed him. I interviewed him about 3 times, and he was just amazing. To explain why it was important to him. And he had this one line, because he was talking about school writing, and I hope I can get it right. But I said, because he was writing, typical analyses of, the Crucible, things like that. And he says, I would rather be the kid who writes the story that other people analyze than the kid analyzing other people's stories.
Exactly.
And I think, yeah, but we always put them in, that somebody else tells the fiction story or writes the fiction story, and then you as a reader analyze it, or interpret it or answer questions about it. But you're rarely the person who writes the story that other people might be reading and thinking about. So he was a great guide.
Do you have any sense of why fiction is so bound in schools?
Well, I think all kinds of ways. I think teachers themselves, it's almost like a compounding of influences. Teachers themselves, probably never had a chance to write fiction in high school, and in college. To get into a fiction class, you usually have to go through like 2 or 3 courses before that, and it's often very selective and hard to get into, not required as part of your teacher training, so that you've never had the experience of it yourself. And as you know, that, having the experience of writing, whatever, it helps you become a writing teacher. And if you don't have that experience, then you're reluctant to get in there, because you don't have the instincts on how to do it. Then I think the curriculum for high school tends to focus on analytic writing, often about literature. So you're writing literary analysis, which is really, when you think about it, a very narrow and form of writing that's hardly, certain people do it. You have book reviewers, you have, people, academics who write about literature, but that's really a very narrow focus. But that's often focused, in advanced placement courses. I think that we're bound by just kind of the rigid way writing is taught. And the kids I interviewed talked about that a lot. They talked about the kind of formulaic writing that they were asked to do, which I think a lot of them could do it. It isn't like but they didn't want to do it, and they didn't like to do it. And they found it odd that, this great imaginative capacity that they had to invent worlds had no place in school. Had some place outside of school. Because you have these websites that, they write, fan fiction, and you have like, these sites that might have almost 1 million pieces of fan fiction just on Harry Potter.
Right.
So you have this world out there where people are writing fiction, but not in school.
It's true. It's true. I see that a lot, with the Writers Academy kids. Their writing is so separate from what they're doing in school. It's their whole other life, right? It's almost like leading these 2 lives, like where you perform in school to write these assignments, but their true writing happens outside.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and some of them think that's the way it should be because school just cannot accommodate them. And some of them have the experience of being in school where they have teachers who can make it work for them.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, to hear them talk about those teachers who can make it work for them. As they go for it, and they maybe give them some guidelines, but they give them freedom too. And,
Yeah.
and not every kid I think wants to do it, but I would just go into like Dover Middle School and just, as just recruiting kids who might be interested. And I just would ask, if you had a choice between writing fiction and nonfiction, how many would you choose nonfiction and how many of you would choose fiction? And usually the majority, and sometimes the big majority, would say fiction. And in some classes, certainly Mark Holt Shannon's class, that Mark, they had that choice, but I don't think they had it very much. So here's this desire to do it, but no opportunity to do it.
Yeah, I see that as well. And I think there's, I don't know, maybe some kind of fear of teaching fiction too, right? Because even with the younger kids, if they write something violent or, you wrote about that in the boys book, and how, it's seen as, oh my gosh, we need to get in touch with the counselor. He's writing about, stabbing someone or whatever the case. So I think there's this kind of fear that exists in allowing kids freedom, even though I would say if we trust them, they'll be fine.
Yeah. And, one of the things I did back when I was writing about boys literacy is I'd go into schools and I said, well, do you have a policy about violence in writing? And so, yeah, you can't have killings. You can't have, we don't want them to have using violence in their writing. And then I said, well, do you have the same policy about reading? And they would pause, as they should. And they'd say, well, no.
Mm-hmm.
Of course not. You couldn't, if you said, we don't want violence in reading, everything would be gone. There, to have a plot, you have to have some kind of threat, some kind of danger, some kind of a situation where people could get hurt, might get hurt, do get hurt.
Right.
The Bible, the Iliad, the Odyssey. I mean, take any classic, Romeo and Juliet. It's like what would have to be, left out of the curriculum if you had that rule for reading. But the idea is, okay, but if you read Romeo and Juliet, even with all the violence, it's kind of uplifting, it's important, it's culturally important, But if you'd write something like that, if you'd write something like Beowulf, right, where, Beowulf stabs Grendel in the eye with his sword, and so such force that the sword breaks, and so the broken blade of the sword is stuck in Grendel's eye, which is the kind of image that I think, like 4th and 5th grade boys, 3rd grade boys really would love, and would use. But if they did it, that would be, geez, that's excessive, that's kind of deviant. But if it's in a classic like Beowulf, well, that's uplifting and gives you some sense of the history of British literature, and it's good for you. So one of the things that the kind of theme that's really ran through the book on boys and this one is just the double standard, that you make certain assumptions about reading, like that reading, for example, reading fiction is uplifting. It helps you create greater empathy. It helps you confront moral issues. On and on and on. And I agree with that. But if you make that case about reading fiction, couldn't you make that case maybe even more powerfully about writing fiction? And
I love that part in the book when you start to talk about that, because to write a character, right, do you have to go more deeply than reading a character?
I think you do. I mean, you have to stay with that character. To create, I think you have to. And then how does that, once you, if a character has certain fears and certain attitudes, how does that manifest it in behavior?
Right.
So I think you really have to go deep, to create a character like, you think the great characters like, Holden Caulfield, how deeply do you have to go inside that psychology to create a character like that? So I think that, one of the things I would talk to the kids about is how, does writing fiction help you kind of explore psychology? And a lot of them were very interested in psychology, what's it like to be afraid? Why do people do certain things? How do people change? How do people confront their fears? So that it's a kind of a, activity in applied psychology.
Absolutely. I think it is, So I'm wondering if you have a favorite story from interviewing all of these kids.
Yes, I do have one. And this young woman, Eve, was talking about a class where she had to write a paper on how to do something, a process paper like that.
Mhm.
And she would just shook her head, how to do something, how to make a peanut butter sandwich, how to saddle a horse. She says, I am not going to spend my life writing. I'm not going to spend 1 minute of my time writing on how to make a peanut butter sandwich. I'm not going to do it. And so she said, so she had this idea, and she went up to the teacher, says, I would like to write, her name was Eve, I would like to write a process paper on how to be Eve. And the teacher says, well, as long as you, do what I'm expecting, do it. And so Eve says, if something like, if you're having a midlife crisis or just want a cool Halloween costume, a cool idea for Halloween, the solution is being Eve. And so she transformed that assignment on how to be Eve. So I like that story, just how, and she just says, I'm not, some of these kids played the game. She says, I'm just not going to play this game. I'm going to turn this into something that's interesting. And I I've had a little contact with her since. I just wish her the best because it's almost like as she described the confinement of school writing, she just got it so right.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I did in the book is I would say, if you had to give advice to teachers, what would they be? And if you had to give advice to students, what advice would you give? And boy, they, I've been giving advice to teachers for a long time, but I couldn't have given it more articulately or more accurately than I think they did. So one of the great pleasures of this book was to elicit these voices. And so it wasn't, I obviously have some ideas about, how to teach fiction, how to teach writing, but to have them be the teachers, to have them be the experts. And then, and it was amazing because I didn't know these kids. I didn't have these, a lot of times I would just send an email invitation, a Zoom invitation to this kid in California. And then we'd, connected with, I have maybe 40 minutes, 30 minutes with this kid, and just how they opened up and talked. It was really special.
That must have been sort of an interesting way to write a book, right? Because you're just kind of sitting back and listening a lot.
Yeah. And having them be having them be the teachers. And I think, not to brag, but
just go ahead and brag.
one of the things, and I think I get this from my mom, because she was good at bringing other people out. People would come to our house, and she wasn't the storyteller, but she could make the other people be the storyteller. Not make them, but create the receptivity. And I almost felt that I was maybe channeling my mom a little bit, and like I was trying to treat these kids like they were really special, like writers on a New England stage. I want to know your story. I want to know, like you wrote this novel. Some of these kids would write do the November novel writing, so they would have written like a 20,000, 30,000 words in November. And I said, well, how did you keep it up? How did you do it? And then my favorite question was, and I'd preface it by saying, this is kind of a weird question, but if it sounds too weird, just don't answer it. And I said, imagine yourself writing, and if I could go inside your head, what would I see? What would be going on? And then pause, because I don't think they'd ever been quite asked that question before.
Yeah.
Okay. And then they might say, it's like I'm watching this movie, but I'm not just watching the movie. I'm also making the movie and deciding what happens in the movie. So it's this kind of double, so they'd find some kind of metaphor. And this other girl says, you're inside my head. You'd just be crushed by the flow of ideas.
That's a good one.
Just I would read it, this, so so that was so it's more. I mean, I've done interviewing before, obviously, but I think this book relied on the interviews as the central, I guess, teaching tool. And so, and whether how teachers react to that, whether they'd rather have something more systematic like me, like kind of laying out how to teach fiction. But I mean, I think if they stay with it, they'll learn from these kids how to do it. And these eighth graders, so a lot of eighth graders. I mean, I thought, you guys could run the world a lot better than the adults we have now. Just how smart and how insightful they were about writing and about education.
Gives you hope for the future, doesn't it?
It really does. I think I think if you're in any kind of despair, talk to a smart eighth grader, and I think that will kind of pull you out.
I know. I miss working with kids directly. We're trying to set up stuff online, but that sense of, just looking a kid in the eye and just having that conversation, I miss that a lot.
Yeah. And if and I think this goes back to the work with Don Graves, if you just give them space to talk about what they're doing, you learn a lot. You learn a lot.
You don't just learn a lot. You're just kind of constantly like, whoa. I mean, surprised, and how articulate and thoughtful and smart they are.
And I think sometimes people, even if you just read their writing, you might get one sense, but then you talk to them about what they're trying to do and what it means to them. And one of the things I love to do, and I did this as a teacher, is in all the interviews, I would just read back to them a passage that I really loved, just maybe not even to engage them in conversation, but just to say, okay, I just like this passage, and here's why I liked it, and it made me really frightened because of the way you describe this scene. Or there's this one scene where this guy was tied up. Okay, he was tied up in this room, and it takes almost a full page to describe the untying of the knots of the guy's wrist, and I just asked him, I read that passage and said, how did you imagine the detail of untying, like you're tied up, how did you imagine the detail of just untying those knots? And so he talked about how he kind of drew the room and drew where the character was. So yeah, I don't know, I forget what your question was, but things like that were really special. And
I can't help but think of knots and being bound. I mean, that's kind of.
Yeah, and he untied the knots.
Yeah, I love that. So you've in the past always talked about how finishing a book is like losing a friend in a way. Did you have those same kind of feelings when you finished this book?
Yeah, I did. I think, mainly it was like getting, leaving the interviews, like putting those aside, and yeah, I always did it. And it's really weird at the end of the book, I'm not sure how this will work, but I just had like an hour of writing that I did, in probably April. And so we're just into the COVID thing. And I was thinking, I mean, not that I felt particularly threatened, but I think particularly then we all kind of felt threatened. Is this going to come for us? Is this, how much time do we have? And when you think about that, it kind of clarifies things in a little bit. What matters?
Mm-hmm.
You don't have an infinite amount of time, but what really matters? What do we want to really fight for and fight against, and focus on? And I think fiction is one of the things that, in storytelling, that we should fight for. And I think sometimes, that's diminished. And so it's kind of like at the end of the book, there's this kind of like, I don't know, not to be too dramatic about it, but a little bit of an existential moment, like because it felt that way to me.
Yeah.
What really matters? what really matters. And I think the proximity of death causes you to think that way. And I think that, so I think that the kind of the ending of the book saying like, I feel like this is my, and I don't know whether there's more that I have to write, but this could be my last thing that I write, you know, and I want to say certain things. I want to make a claim for certain things. And I think that you know, we sometimes we present writing in a way that's way too formulaic, that's way too unappealing, that doesn't tap into the interests of students, that's too deferential or controlled by reading. You know, where writing is, you know, you write explications of reading, you know, so it's bound. And it's time to unbind it. It's time for writing to achieve its proper power. And I don't think that it did. And so, I mean, I'm just kind of rambling, but I just thought at this ending point, because the book is ending, but a lot of things seem to be ending. To make that case.
Yeah. I think you have a lot more time and a lot more books, by the way.
I hope so. I hope so. But it made me think. You know.
I think it made all of us think, especially sort of being, you know, trapped in your house and not really sure what the future held. I guess we still don't know, but.
And I think it's gone on longer and crazier than, you know, we even imagined. So.
I know. Do you have any words of wisdom for us?
I think we'll get through it. I think that we've gotten through these things in the past. I mean, I think, again, referring to my parents, it kind of like my parents got married in June of 1941. And so Pearl Harbor happened like 5 months later. And my dad was drafted probably in 42 then. Right. And was gone for 3 years. And, you know, there's rationing and he was away from her. And I think the sacrifice they made, you know, I mean, other generations, I think, have made bigger sacrifices. People who made it through the Depression, like my mom's father, who they almost lost their farm, you know, didn't. You know, other generations have gone through things that are, I think, even harder than what we're going through now. And I think maybe that perspective, and they got through it. You know, my dad came back, they got married, started a family, and I think we'll get through it.
And doesn't it seem like a perfect time to write fiction and to try to maybe come up with all these different endings, right? To practice that sense of empathy, but in reaction to really what's happening in the world, right? I don't know.
Yeah, in a way, because you have all the kind of normal structures kind of, you know, fluid, you know, it's like, you know, normally you go to school and school is like 5 days a week and, you know, you got, you know, your schedule and now it's like, you know, things are changing so that the world could be different, you know, we're having to be real resilient. And so I think it is a good time to imagine alternative worlds and, you know, maybe extremer versions of what we're going through, how they test us. So I think it is this kind of interesting time that's where the stability and certainty of our lives have been really kind of upended.
Yeah. I mean, that seems like maybe a good place to stop because I think it's like you make this argument to set the writing free, and yeah, maybe this is the perfect time for that.
I think so. And it just seems to me it has so much potential, and we don't realize it, and we think that you know, that it's creative writing, and in the real world, you know, this kind of creativity doesn't matter, and nobody's going to pay attention to it, and it's not going to work for us. And you know, I think like Dave Pilkey, the creator of my favorite series, Captain Underpants.
Yeah.
You know, and the story that he tells of like how his principal he was in the hallway or something. He was drawing some, his like silly Captain Under, because he had the idea really, early, almost as a kid. And it's just like, if you think you're going to make a living by drawing silly cartoons about a principal who thinks he's a superhero, you're really totally mistaken. And, we can't predict what's going to happen, but I think creativity, imagination, imagining other worlds, I think that's pretty powerful preparation for the future. It's a great thing to be doing in the present, in the moment, but I think that the sense that only kind of a dry, formulaic, analytic kind of writing is what's going to count, I don't think so. I think we're going to need storytellers, and we're going to need people who can imagine other worlds, and I think we probably always have. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much, and everyone should look for the book coming out this spring, February, right?
Yeah, I don't know whether things have slowed down because of the pandemic, but that's the schedule. Next spring for sure.
Right. Yeah, so thank you for taking this time to talk about this book, and as always, just to chat and find out what's going on in your head. I almost asked you that question, but I'm like, I don't know. What would we see?
You'd be crushed by the flow of ideas.